7 minutes, one nation. 43 years of technological dominance questioned in a single strategic calculation. That is the distilled essence of what keeps American defense planners awake at night. That is the number of words required to frame the vulnerability that Iran has been meticulously studying, documenting, and preparing to exploit should conflict ever escalate beyond the threshold of no return. But those words do not capture what the E-3 Sentry truly represents to American power projection. They do not explain why a 4-decade-old aircraft flying on a platform designed in the 1950s remains the single most critical node in the entire American war-fighting apparatus across the Middle East. They do not reveal what losing even one of these aircraft would mean to the pilot climbing into an F-15E Strike Eagle, knowing that the invisible guardian watching over them might not be there when Iranian missiles start tracking. They do not convey the psychological weight carried by every crew member who understands with absolute clarity that their aircraft is irreplaceable. The threat is theoretical. The vulnerability is not. Understand something fundamental about the E-3 Sentry that military analysts consistently fail to communicate to general audiences. When defense commentators describe it as an AWACS platform, an acronym standing for Airborne Warning and Control System, they reduce a revolutionary capability to a bureaucratic designation. They make it sound like a flying antenna, something that listens and reports and passes messages along a chain. That description is accurate in the way that describing the human brain as an electrical organ is accurate. It captures the mechanism while completely missing the function. The E-3 Sentry is not a sensor platform. The E-3 Sentry is the central nervous system of American air dominance. It is the difference between an air force that operates and an air force that dominates. It is the difference between coordinated lethality and fragmented confusion. And that difference is precisely what Iran has spent years learning how to neutralize. The aircraft itself tells a story that begins before most of the pilots who depend on it were born. Boeing delivered the first operational E-3 to the United States Air Force in March 1977. The airframe underneath the distinctive rotating dome is a modified Boeing 707, a commercial airliner design that first flew passengers in 1958. That airframe was chosen not for its combat characteristics, but for its range, its payload capacity, and its ability to remain airborne for extended missions without refueling. The aircraft can stay aloft for more than 8 hours on internal fuel. With aerial refueling, that endurance extends essentially indefinitely, limited only by crew fatigue and consumables. But the airframe is not the weapon. The 30-foot radar dome mounted above the fuselage, rotating 6 times per minute on a hydraulic mechanism that has been refined across 4 decades of operational experience. That dome is what transforms a modified passenger jet into the most powerful situational awareness platform ever deployed in combat. The radar inside that dome is designated AN/APY-2, and its capabilities define what modern integrated air warfare looks like when executed by a properly equipped force. Operating at altitudes between 29,000 and 40,000 feet, the E-3's radar can detect low-flying aircraft and cruise missiles at ranges exceeding 250 miles. It can track high-altitude targets at distances approaching 400 miles. It can distinguish between 600 individual aircraft simultaneously, maintaining separate tracking files on each target, updating their position, speed, heading, and altitude every 10 seconds. It can identify aircraft not merely by their radar return, but by their electronic emissions, matching radar signatures and communication patterns against a library of known systems that represents decades of intelligence collection. It can detect ballistic missiles from the moment their rocket motors ignite and track their trajectory through every phase of flight until impact or interception. And it does all of this while simultaneously managing the communications that connect every friendly aircraft in its coverage area into a single integrated fighting force. That last capability is the one Iran understands most clearly and fears most deeply. The E-3 does not simply watch the battle unfold. The E-3 orchestrates the battle in real time. Its crew of mission specialists, typically numbering between 13 and 19 depending on the specific configuration and mission requirements, includes weapons controllers, surveillance operators, communications technicians, and tactical coordinators whose job is not merely to observe, but to direct. When an American F-35 pilot approaches Iranian airspace, that pilot is not relying solely on the sensors built into their own aircraft. That pilot is receiving a continuously updated picture of the entire battlespace transmitted directly from the E-3 overhead. Every Iranian radar installation that activates, the E-3 sees it first and tells the pilot exactly where it is. Every Iranian interceptor that launches, the E-3 tracks it from the moment its wheels leave the runway and feeds the pilot its heading, its speed, its probable armament, its estimated intercept geometry. Every surface-to-air missile battery that begins tracking, the E-3 detects the radar emissions and warns the pilot before the missile ever launches. The pilot flying toward hostile territory is not flying alone. The pilot is flying as part of an integrated system in which the E-3 serves as the brain, processing information from dozens of sources and distributing it to every node that needs it in the fractions of a second that combat demands. Remove the E-3 from that equation, and everything changes. Not slightly, fundamentally. The pilot who flew yesterday with complete situational awareness now flies with fragments of a picture. The coordination that allowed 4 aircraft to execute a precisely synchronized strike on multiple targets simultaneously now degrades into individual aircraft making individual decisions based on individual sensor coverage. The early warning that gave pilots minutes to prepare for incoming threats now shrinks to seconds or disappears entirely. The deconfliction that prevented fratricide in contested airspace now becomes a matter of chance rather than coordination. The American air campaign that functions as a single integrated organism now fractures into isolated elements, hoping their individual capabilities will be enough to survive what they cannot fully see coming. That is what Iran has been studying. That is what Iran has been planning to exploit. That is what keeps the E-3 Sentry on the target list of every adversary who has watched American air power dominate every conflict it has entered for the past 3 decades. The vulnerability Iran is examining exists not in the air but on the ground. The E-3 Sentry, for all its capabilities once airborne, spends most of its existence parked on runways at bases that Iran has mapped down to the individual taxiway. Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, locations that appear in no tourist guidebook but that feature prominently in Iranian targeting databases built over years of patient observation. The aircraft requires extensive ground support. It needs specialized maintenance equipment. It needs trained crews who take hours to brief before each mission. It needs fuel, supplies, and secure communications infrastructure that ties it to the broader command network. All of those dependencies create windows of vulnerability that a sophisticated adversary can measure, predict, and exploit with precision. The mathematics of that vulnerability are unforgiving. The United States Air Force operates 31 E-3 Sentry aircraft in total active inventory. Not 31 in the Middle East, 31 on the planet. The production line that built them closed in 1992. No new airframes exist. No manufacturing capability remains to create them. Every E-3 lost is an E-3 that cannot be replaced with an equivalent system. The replacement program, built around the Boeing E-7 Wedgetail, has been approved, funded, and initiated, but the first operational E-7 is not expected to reach Air Force squadrons until 2027 at the earliest, and the full transition will take years beyond that date. In the interim, the E-3 fleet represents an irreplaceable capability that shrinks with every airframe lost to combat, accident, or age-related retirement. Iran does not need to destroy all 31 aircraft. Iran needs to destroy enough of them to create gaps in coverage that American pilots cannot close with remaining assets. The threshold for that outcome is far lower than most public assessments acknowledge. Iranian strategic planners have published their analysis of this vulnerability in terms that leave little room for misinterpretation. The E-3 represents what Iranian military theorists call a high-value, low-density target, meaning an asset whose military value vastly exceeds its numerical availability. Destroying even a small number of E-3 aircraft produces effects disproportionate to the resources required to achieve that destruction. A single ballistic missile that costs Iran perhaps $2 million to build and launch, if it successfully destroys an E-3 that cost over $270 million and cannot be replaced, produces a return on investment that no other target category can match. Iranian commanders have studied this calculation. Iranian commanders have built their targeting priorities around this calculation, and Iranian commanders have invested years of intelligence collection into understanding exactly where these aircraft are positioned at any given moment across the bases where they operate. The intelligence requirement for such targeting is substantial, but not insurmountable. The E-3 fleet does not park in random locations. Aircraft that require extensive ground support equipment tend to cluster near the maintenance facilities that service them. Flight schedules, while classified, produce patterns that patient observation can detect over time. Communication signatures, maintenance cycles, crew rotations, fuel deliveries, all of these generate observable indicators that a determined intelligence apparatus can collect and correlate into a predictive picture of where specific aircraft will be positioned on specific nights. Iran has invested heavily in precisely this kind of long-duration intelligence collection across every American installation within range of its sensors and its human networks. The results of that investment do not appear in public Iranian statements. They appear in the targeting packages that Iranian missile forces maintain for the day when political leadership authorizes their use. They exist as silent files in classified servers, waiting for a command that has not yet been given. The countermeasures available to American commanders are limited by physics and mathematics that no budget increase can change. The E-3 can be protected on the ground through hardened shelters, dispersal across multiple locations, and increased security against infiltration. All of those measures reduce vulnerability without eliminating it. The E-3 can be protected in the air by keeping it flying during periods of heightened threat, but continuous flight operations impose crew fatigue, maintenance stress, and fuel consumption that a small fleet cannot sustain indefinitely. The E-3 can be protected through deception, using false signals and decoy positions to confuse targeting, but that requires intelligence about what Iranian sensors are actually detecting, intelligence that American analysts may not possess with sufficient precision. Every protection measure available reduces risk without eliminating it. The fundamental asymmetry remains. Iran can produce missiles faster and cheaper than America can produce E-3 replacements. And Iran knows exactly where those irreplaceable aircraft are sitting tonight. The implications extend beyond the immediate theater in ways that observers in Moscow and Beijing are studying with professional attention. Russia operates its own equivalent to the E-3, the Beriev A-50, and has experienced its own losses in Ukraine that demonstrate the vulnerability of high-value airborne platforms to determined adversaries. Russian military analysts understand precisely what E-3 losses would mean to American operations because they have lived through equivalent losses themselves. They are watching Iranian capabilities develop. They are watching American defensive adaptations. They are calculating what lessons might apply to their own potential conflicts against NATO forces that depend on similar platforms. China operates the KJ-2000 and KJ-500. Platforms that fill the same niche in Chinese doctrine that the E-3 fills in American doctrine. Chinese planners are watching Iran develop the targeting methodology, the intelligence architecture, and the strike capabilities necessary to threaten irreplaceable American ISR platforms in their ground vulnerability windows. The proof of concept, if Iran ever demonstrates it successfully, becomes a template that other adversaries can adapt to other theaters against other targets. The E-3 today, the RC-135 tomorrow, the E-8 Joint Stars the day after. The entire American system of systems depends on platforms that exist in small numbers, cannot be rapidly replaced, and must eventually land somewhere that an adversary has been watching. And every adversary is taking careful notes. The crew members who fly these missions understand the risk in personal terms that strategic abstractions cannot capture. They strap into an aircraft older than they are. They fly patterns that take them within range of missiles they might not see coming. They depend on countermeasures and escort fighters and the hope that deterrence will hold tonight the way it held last night and the night before. They do this knowing that they represent a capability their country cannot replace if something goes wrong. They do this knowing that adversaries have spent years building the intelligence picture necessary to find them at their most vulnerable. They do this because the pilots who depend on them need them to do it, and because no alternative exists that provides equivalent capability while the replacement program slowly works its way through development timelines measured in years. The burden they carry is not merely professional. It is existential in the original meaning of that word. Their existence in the air keeps the system functioning. Their absence would leave gaps that nothing else can fill. Here is where the strategic calculation stands as of this moment. Iran possesses the missiles. Iran possesses the intelligence architecture. Iran possesses the strategic motivation. What Iran has not possessed to this point is the political decision to translate capability into action. That decision has remained on hold through cycles of tension and de-escalation, through periods when conflict seemed imminent, and periods when diplomatic pathways appeared to offer alternatives. The E-3s that flew tonight flew under the protection of that political restraint rather than under the protection of any defense that could guarantee their survival if restraint ended. Every pilot in this theater understands that distinction. Even if they never speak it aloud, they fly because the mission requires it. They fly because alternatives do not exist. They fly because someone in Tehran has not yet given the order that would turn theoretical vulnerability into burning wreckage. And they fly knowing that the gap between theoretical and actual can close in less time than it takes to reach a shelter. The eyes are watching. The question that no briefing answers, because no briefing can answer it with certainty, is whether those eyes will still be watching tomorrow,